All right, let's dive in. Today we're tackling werewolves and shapeshifters.
Ooh, fascinating topic.
We've got some amazing source material to unpack.
Yeah. Like what?
Well, we've got this incredible book from the 1800s all about werewolves.
19th century.
Then we've got some legal documents and even some really old stories from, get this, Project Gutenberg.
Project Gutenberg for werewolves. That's kind of
You'd
surprising.
be surprised. The idea of shape-shifting, it pops up everywhere, all different cultures, different time periods. It's really a fundamental part of, well, the human experience.
Yeah, I can see that. You know, these stories, they've been told and retold for centuries, right? They really give you a window into how people thought, what they were afraid of, how they tried to explain the things they just couldn't understand.
Exactly. And that's what we're going to do today. We're going to try to understand these stories. And we're going to start with, well, werewolves, the classic shapeshifter.
Gotta start somewhere.
So in this book we found, the Book of Werewolves, there's this crazy story about a soldier in France who could supposedly turn into a wolf.
Okay, hold on. Every culture has their werewolf stories. What makes this one so special?
The detail.
Yeah.
It describes the whole transformation step by step.
Oh, I see. Okay.
So the soldier, he's with the guy telling the story,
Yeah.
and suddenly he just rips off all his clothes.
Okay.
And get this, the clothes, they turn to stone.
Oh.
Poof. Gone, just like that.
Wow.
And then the soldier, he turns into a wolf right there in front of the narrator.
No way.
Yeah. But here's the thing. When he changes back, he's got this wound on his neck. Like he got hurt while he was a wolf.
Ooh, that's interesting. So it makes you think, right? Like the human form, the wolf form, are they connected somehow? Can you get hurt as a wolf and it shows up when you're human again?
It's a good question. It makes you wonder about, well, the nature of the transformation. Is it just physical? Or is there something more going on? Something, I don't know, deeper?
Yeah, deeper. Like what about the mind? Does the soldier think like a wolf when he's transformed?
Well, that's where it gets really interesting. The book, it talks about this concept called Agi Einherrer.
Eigi Einnahmer.
Yeah, it basically means shape-shifting, but keeping your human mind.
Oh, so like you look like a wolf, but you still think like a human.
Exactly. So it's not just about, looking like an animal. It's about the mind, too, which adds a whole other level to things.
It does. You know, that idea that you keep your human intelligence when you shapeshift, it pops up in a lot of different cultures. It makes you wonder, what does it really mean to be human? Is it our bodies? Or is it our minds, our thoughts?
That's deep. And speaking of things that are deep, the book also mentions this belief that the eyes, they stay the same during the transformation.
Wait, what? The eyes?
Yeah. So, like, someone could turn into a wolf or a bear or whatever, but you'd still recognize them by their eyes. Kind of creepy, right?
It is creepy, but also kind of cool. Like the eyes are the window to the soul, right? So
Yeah.
even if the body changes, that human essence, it's still there looking out at you.
I never thought of it like that. And it's not just in this book. We see shapeshifting in a lot of old Norse stories, too.
Oh yeah, the sagas, they're full of that stuff.
Right. Like in the Volsung saga, there are these guys who use wolf skins to transform into wolves. But they can only stay wolves for 10 days.
10 days? That's not a lot of time.
Nope. Talk about a time limit.
It makes you think, though, about control. You know, maybe shape-shifting isn't something you can just do whenever you want. Maybe there are rules, limits, consequences. Like, what happens after 10 days? Do they just turn back whether they want to or not?
That's a good question. And then there's another story in the Froll saga Kreka. This one's about a king's son, Bjorn. He vanishes and everyone thinks he's gone for good. But later they find him living as a werebear.
A werebear, that's different.
I know, right? And he's living with this Carl's daughter. Like he's chosen this new life, this new identity.
Huh. So it makes you think, is it choice or is it fate? Did Bjorn want to be a werebear or was it something that happened to him? And what about his old life, his family, his responsibilities? Did he just leave all that behind?
That's what's so fascinating about these stories. They raise so many questions. And speaking of questions, what about shapeshifters who aren't werewolves? What about, I don't know, swan maidens?
Swan maidens, like the women who turn into swans?
Exactly.
Oh, yeah, those are classic.
They're all over folklore. And guess what? They transform using special feather dresses.
Feather dresses, seriously.
Seriously, it's like clothes make the man, or in this case, the swan.
Haha, that's one way to put it. So hold on, they need the dress to transform.
That's what the stories say.
That's That makes you think, doesn't it? Like maybe the ability to change, it's not always something you have total control over. Maybe it's tied to something outside yourself.
Right. And the book actually gives an example from, get this, the Volsum saga again.
Hmm.
This guy, he steals a swan maiden's feather dress, and she's stuck in human form until she gets it back.
Well, that's kind of messed up.
I know. It's like, it's not just clothing. It's like a symbol of her power, her freedom. And when it's taken away, she loses that freedom.
Yeah, that's deep. It makes you think about all the things in life that can hold us back, trap us. Sometimes they're external things, like that feather dress. But sometimes they're things we create ourselves, our own fears, our own beliefs.
That's so true. But you know what's even more interesting? This idea that the feather dress, it represents something even bigger.
What do you mean?
Well, think about it. The swan maiden, she can change between human form and swan form, right?
Right.
So what if the dress, it's not just a dress, it's like a symbol of the soul being able to exist in different bodies.
Whoa, okay, I see what you're saying. So like the swan maiden's soul, it's just visiting the human world for a while, but it really
Ah,
belongs to the swan.
exactly. And this idea that the soul can inhabit different bodies, it's not just in these swan maiden stories, it pops up all over the place.
You're right. Like in Norse mythology, Loki, the trickster god, he borrows Freyja's feather dress so he can shapeshift.
That's right. And in Buddhism, they believe the soul changes its cage or its vesture every time it's reborn.
Yeah. So maybe these stories, they're ancient people's way of trying to make sense of something that they just couldn't explain. The soul.
Yeah, and maybe not just the soul. Maybe they were trying to understand the whole world around them, especially the things they couldn't see or touch.
Like, how do you explain thunder if you don't know about weather patterns and electricity? You make up a story about the gods riding their chariots across the sky.
Right. It gives people a way to understand, to make sense of the world, even if it's not scientifically accurate.
Exactly. And those stories, they get passed down and they become part of the culture, part of the way people see the world.
Now let's shift gears a little bit. Let's talk about lycanthropy, but from a different perspective, a legal perspective.
Legal perspective, you mean like werewolf laws?
You'd be surprised. But first, did you know that the word werewolf, it didn't always mean a literal wolf man?
Wait, what? It didn't.
Nope. In some old legal texts, like the Lex Ripuaria and the Laws of Canute, werewolf sometimes just meant outlaw.
Oh, interesting. So not someone who turns into a wolf, but just like a dangerous person, someone outside the law.
Exactly.
Huh. It makes sense, though. If you're afraid of someone, someone who doesn't follow the rules, you might call them a monster, a werewolf. It's a way to label them to make them seem less human, more threatening.
I never thought of it that way, but it makes a lot of sense. And you know, speaking of werewolves and the law, there's this really creepy historical case we found.
Ah, tell me more.
It's the trial of Gilles Garnier, the hermit of Saint Bonnot, back in the 1500s.
Gilles Garnier. Okay, never heard of her.
He was accused of attacking children near this town in France Dole.
Attacking children, that's awful.
Yeah, and get this. They said he was attacking them in wolf form.
In wolf form. So they actually believed he was a werewolf.
They did. And it wasn't just some rumor or legend. They put him on trial for it.
Wow. So this wasn't just folklore. People genuinely believed that humans could turn into wolves and, do terrible things.
It's pretty scary to think about.
It is. But it also makes you realize how powerful belief can be, especially back then when people didn't have the same understanding of science and psychology that we have today.
Right. They didn't have all the explanations we have now. So they turned to things like magic and superstition to make sense of the world.
It's like if something bad happened and you couldn't explain it, you might blame it on a werewolf or a witch or some other supernatural force.
It's easier to believe in a monster than to face the darkness that might exist within ourselves, you know?
You know what's really disturbing about this case, though? The details.
Oh, yeah. The trial records, they're really graphic.
They describe the attacks, the dates, the locations, even the ages of the victims. It's pretty hard to read.
I know. It's a reminder that even though we're talking about these stories, these legends, there's a dark side to humanity that's very real.
And sometimes that darkness, it can't be explained away by magic or monsters.
It makes you think about how much our understanding of the world has changed over time, doesn't it?
It does. We have so much more knowledge now about science, about psychology, about the human brain.
But even with all that knowledge, there are still things we can't explain. Things that make us wonder, things that keep us up at night.
Like what?
We're like the question of why some people are capable of such incredible cruelty.
Yeah, that's a tough one.
Our werewolf book actually talks about this.
Uh-huh.
It suggests that one of the reasons people believe in werewolves is because they've seen the cruelty that humans are capable of.
You're saying that the idea of the werewolf, it comes from our own experience of human evil.
In a way, yeah. Like we see how cruel people can be to each other and we think maybe there's something monstrous inside of us, something that can turn us into beasts.
I see. So the werewolf, it becomes a symbol of that inner darkness.
Exactly. And the book, it gives some pretty disturbing examples of human cruelty. Like there was this guy, Andreas Bichel, who was executed in the early 1800s. He seemed to enjoy causing pain to others.
That's awful.
It is. And it's a reminder that even without werewolves, without magic, without any supernatural explanations, there are people out there who do terrible things.
Yeah, and sometimes it's not just about enjoying other people's pain. Sometimes it's about something even darker, something more primal,
Like what?
like a pure, uncontrolled urge to kill. The book mentions this violin player who confessed to 34 murders.
34 murders.
Yeah, and he said he'd do it simply because he liked it.
That's chilling. It's like the monster isn't something you turn into. It's something you already are deep down.
And sometimes that monster, it can hide behind a mask of normalcy.
What do you mean?
Well, think about the Maréchal de Retz. He was this nobleman, a scholar, a military leader. By all accounts, he was a respected member of society.
Right, but then
But then he suddenly descended into this spiral of cruelty.
looks like something snapped inside of it.
Exactly. And they said it all started after he read about the Roman emperors, the ones who were known for their excesses and brutality.
So, like, he read about these cruel emperors, and it awakened something dark within him.
It's possible. And his case, it's particularly disturbing because he wasn't just cruel to, enemies or criminals. He was accused of horrific acts against children.
Yeah, the details of his trial are pretty hard to stomach.
It makes you think about the nature of evil, doesn't it? Like, is it something we're born with? Or is it something that can be learned or triggered by certain experiences?
Those are tough questions.
They are, and I don't think there are any easy answers.
It's enough to make you wonder if maybe those old werewolf stories, those tales of monstrous transformations, maybe they were just people trying to make sense of the darkness they saw in the world and in themselves.
Trying to find an explanation for something they couldn't understand.
And maybe, just maybe, those stories still have something to teach us today about the complexities of human nature, about the potential for both good and evil that exists within us all.
Maybe they're a warning, or maybe they're a challenge to confront the darkness within ourselves and to strive to be better, to be more human. And, it's not just about cruelty. Hallucinations and mania, those could have played a role too. The book actually mentions people with fevers thinking their limbs are made of glass.
Really?
Yeah. So maybe back then, some folks really thought they were turning into wolves, like it was a real physical or mental thing, but they just didn't understand it the way we do now.
That's a good point. I mean, we know how connected the mind and body are, right?
Hmm.
So if your body's out of whack, your mind could be too. And back then, they didn't have all the medical knowledge we have now.
Exactly. I mean, imagine trying to explain a hallucination without knowing anything about, like, neurology or psychology. You might think you're actually seeing a monster,
It makes you wonder how much of what they thought was real was just, well, their minds playing tricks on them.
Right. It's like the line between reality and perception, it can get really blurry.
Yeah.
Especially when you throw in things like belief and suggestion. And sometimes, even today, we still struggle to understand the power of the mind.
It's true. And speaking of blurry lines, remember those swan maidens, those feather dresses?
Yeah.
It's like the dress itself, it's what gives them the power to transform.
Yeah. It's more than just clothing. It's like a key, unlocking their true nature.
Right. But it also makes you think, like, what about the times when we feel trapped in our own lives? By our jobs, our relationships, even our own thoughts and beliefs. It's like we're longing for that feather dress, that thing that will help us break free and become who we're meant to be.
It's a powerful image. And, stealing the feather dress, like we see in some of those stories, it's like trying to control that transformative power, trying to possess it for yourself. But it usually doesn't end well.
No, it doesn't. It's like a reminder that true transformation, it has to come from within. You can't force it on someone else or steal it from them. And, feathers themselves, they often represent lightness, freedom, spiritual ascension. So maybe the Swan Maiden's feather dress, it's not just about physical transformation. It's about connecting to something bigger than herself.
I like that. It's like she's shedding the weight of the world, those things that are holding her back, and reaching for something higher, something divine.
Exactly. And, that connection to the divine, it pops up in other shape-shifting stories too, like those shamans who use animal skins and masks to connect with the spirit world.
Right. It's like they're tapping into a different level of consciousness, a power that's beyond the everyday world.
Yeah.
And maybe on a deeper level, all of these shape-shifting stories, they're really about exploring that potential within us, the potential to transcend our limitations and connect with something greater than ourselves.
It's a fascinating thought. And speaking of transcending limitations, what about those berserkers, those Norse warriors who would go into these trance-like states in battle?
Yeah, they were legendary. So fierce, so powerful.
It's like they were channeling some primal animalistic energy. Some accounts even describe them taking on the characteristics of bears or wolves, biting their shields, fighting with incredible ferocity.
It's almost like they became the animals themselves, embodying their power and aggression.
But did they actually transform? Or
Mm.
was it more of a psychological thing, a
Right.
self-induced frenzy?
That's the big question, isn't it? There are all sorts of theories. Some people think they use certain plants or substances to induce these altered states of consciousness.
Like early forms of drugs.
Exactly. Others think it was more about psychological techniques like self-hypnosis or the power of group dynamics.
It's fascinating. Whatever the cause, it's clear they were both feared and respected. I mean, imagine witnessing that kind of power on the battlefield.
Yeah,
Terrifying.
totally. And their story, it makes you think about the power of the mind over the body, right? If they could achieve those feats through sheer willpower or mental manipulation, what does that say about the limits of human potential?
And what about the dangers of tapping into those primal instincts?
Right. I mean, we all have that capacity for both good and evil inside us. The berserkers, they represent that duality, don't they? That raw, untamed power that can be both a source of strength and a force of destruction.
It's a reminder that we have to be careful how we wield that power. And it's interesting how that theme of duality keeps popping up in these shape-shifting stories.
You're right, the werewolves, torn between their human and animal sides, the berserkers channeling those primal instincts. It's like a reflection of our own internal struggles, trying to make sense of those different parts of ourselves.
Maybe that's why these stories are so enduring. They speak to something fundamental about the human experience, this constant battle between the light and the shadow, the reason and the instinct.
I think you're right, and maybe, just maybe, these stories are offering us some guidance on how to navigate that battle, how to integrate those different parts and find a sense of wholeness.
I like that idea. So it's not just about transforming into something new. It's about becoming more whole, more integrated, more fully ourselves.
Exactly. It's about embracing all those different facets that make us human, the good, the bad, and everything in between.
And we've covered a lot of ground here, from werewolves and swan maidens to berserkers and the complexities of human nature.
It's been quite a journey.
But what does it all mean? Why are we so drawn to these stories? What's the underlying message?
Well, one possibility is that these stories, they reflect our own journeys of transformation, our own struggles to reconcile those different parts of ourselves.
Like the werewolf, it's a symbol of that beast within that we all have to grapple with.
Right. And the act of shapeshifting itself, it could represent our desire for change, for growth, for becoming something more than we are now.
And that desire, it's not always easy to fulfill. Sometimes it's painful, messy, even frightening.
Like those descriptions of werewolf transformations, the ripping flesh, the contortions, the sheer agony of it all.
Right. It's not always a smooth or glamorous process. But maybe the message is that it's worth it. The struggle, the pain, it's all part of the journey. Like the Swan Maiden, she eventually regains her freedom,
Yeah.
returns to her true nature.
Yeah, it's like a reminder that no matter what challenges we face, we have the power to reclaim our authenticity, to embrace our full potential.
And that potential is always evolving. We're not fixed beings. We're constantly changing, adapting.
And that's okay. Change is a natural part of life. It's how we grow, how we learn, how we become who we're meant to be.
Now, before we move on, there's another aspect of shape-shifting lore we haven't really talked about yet. The trickster.
Oh, the trickster. That's a fun one.
They pop up in so many cultures, so many mythologies, always disrupting the status quo, challenging authority.
And in shape-shifting stories, they often use their powers to deceive, to manipulate, to cause chaos. Think about Loki, from Norse mythology. He's always shape-shifting, playing pranks on the other gods.
He's definitely a troublemaker.
He is. But he also serves a purpose.
Yeah.
He exposes hypocrisy, he questions authority, he forces those around him to confront their own weaknesses. He's like a catalyst for change, even if it's through mischief and mayhem.
It's like sometimes you need a little chaos to shake things up, to make people think differently.
Exactly. And the trickster, especially in the context of shape-shifting, It embodies that transformative power of change itself. Change can be unpredictable, messy, even destructive sometimes, but it's often necessary for growth and evolution.
So it's not just about, like, accepting change.
Yeah.
It's about embracing it, even the messy parts.
Right, and maybe even cultivating a little bit of that trickster energy within ourselves, being willing to question assumptions, to push boundaries, to shake things up a bit in our own lives.
I like that. Embrace the chaos.
Within reason, of course. But yeah, the trickster archetype, it reminds us that sometimes a little bit of disruption can be the catalyst for positive change.
It's like these shape-shifting stories. They're pushing us to think about change on a whole other level. Not just about, like, turning into a wolf or a swan, but about changing who we are on the inside, too.
Yeah, it's about those internal transformations. The way our beliefs change, our values, our whole outlook on life. It's a constant process, really.
And it's not always easy, is it? I mean, think about those werewolf transformations.
Hmm.
All that pain, the ripping, the contorting. It's brutal.
It is. And it's a good metaphor for how change can feel, right? Whether it's personal growth or even societal change, it often means facing those parts of ourselves that we'd rather avoid. Our fears, our limitations, even the darker sides of our nature.
It's like we have to shed our old selves to make space for the new. But sometimes it feels like we're taking one step forward and two steps back. Like we're losing control, regressing.
Like those berserkers we talked about, right? Going into those frenzied states, almost becoming the beasts themselves.
Exactly. It's a reminder that even when we're trying to grow and transform, there's always that pull, that temptation to give in to those primal instincts.
It's a balancing act, for sure. We need to acknowledge all those different parts of ourselves, the light and the dark, the reason and the instinct, but we can't let any one part take over completely.
So it's not just about transforming into something new. It's about becoming more whole, more integrated, more ourselves.
Exactly. Embracing all those different facets that make us human, the good, the bad, and everything in between.
It's a lot to think about. And, we've gone through so much already. The werewolves, the swan maidens, the historical trials, the psychology of it all.
It's been quite a journey, but I think it all points to this one big question. Why do these stories matter? Why are we still so fascinated by them, even after all this time?
I mean, they're entertaining, sure, but there's got to be something more to it, right?
Right, and I think it has to do with that universal human experience of change. We all go through it in different ways. We're constantly adapting, evolving, trying to understand who we are and where we fit in.
And these stories, they give us a way to explore those questions. They give us a framework, a language to talk about those things that are hard to put into words.
Exactly. They help us make sense of the unknown, the things that scare us, the things that challenge our understanding of ourselves and the world around us.
And they remind us that we're not alone in this journey, that people have been wrestling with these same questions for centuries.
It's comforting, in a way, to know that we're not the first ones to face these challenges, and that maybe, just maybe, there's some answers, some wisdom to be found in these ancient tales.
So as we wrap up this deep dive into werewolves and shapeshifting, let's take a moment to reflect on what we've learned. We started with those vivid accounts of transformations, people turning into wolves, swan maidens with their feather dresses, the king's son who became a werebear. We talked about the history, the werewolf trials, how fear and superstition shaped people's beliefs. And we explored those deeper questions about human nature, the capacity for cruelty, the power of belief.
And don't forget those berserkers, those fierce warriors who seem to embody raw, primal power.
Right, and all that symbolism. The feather dress, the trickster. It's amazing how much depth and meaning is packed into these stories.
They're not just fairy tales, they're reflections of the human experience. They offer insights into our fears, our desires, our struggles, and our potential.
And they remind us that transformation is an ongoing process, something we're all engaged in whether we realize it or not.
And that's the beauty of it, right? The journey of becoming, of constantly evolving, of embracing the complexities of who we are.
So, as you go about your day, think about what we've discussed. How do these stories speak to your own journey of growth and change? What resonates with you? What challenges you? What insights can you glean from these ancient tales?
Remember, transformation isn't a one-time event. It's a process, a dance between the light and shadow, the known and the unknown. Embrace the fluidity of self, and don't be afraid to explore those uncharted territories within.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive. We'll see you next time for another exploration into the mysteries of the world and the human experience.